Good evening, and thank you for being here at what may prove to be one of the most critical junctures in modern geopolitical history. The events that have unfolded over the past 48 hours have fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war in Eastern Europe, transforming what many still perceived as a regional conflict into something far more dangerous, something that now carries the unmistakable potential to spiral into a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. What began as a calculated Ukrainian military operation has evolved into a crisis that threatens to redefine not only this war, but the entire global security architecture that has kept the peace between major powers for decades. Moscow is no longer describing this conflict in the measured diplomatic language. We've grown accustomed to hearing the Kremlin has abandoned any pretense of restraint and has now openly, explicitly, and with absolutely zero diplomatic cushioning, accused the United States of America of executing a direct military strike on Russian forces and Russian territory, not supporting, not enabling, not merely providing assistance, but executing. That single word carries implications that cannot be dismissed or understated, because when one nuclear-armed superpower formally declares that another nuclear-armed superpower has directly attacked it, everything changes. The strategic calculus shifts, the psychology of escalation transforms, and the margin for catastrophic miscalculation narrows to something so razor-thin that a single misstep, a single misinterpreted signal, a single moment of poor judgment could send us careening toward consequences that would reshape the world as we know it. The strike that triggered Moscow's explosive accusation was anything but a routine military operation. This was a coordinated, sophisticated, multi-pronged assault on one of Russia's most heavily fortified command and logistics installations, and a facility located well behind the active combat zone, a site that Russian military planners had deemed sufficiently protected and sufficiently distant from Ukrainian reach to house critical command infrastructure, senior military personnel, and vital logistics coordination systems. Ukrainian forces operating with what Russian defense officials have described as live real-time satellite intelligence and precision targeting data of a quality that should have been impossible for them to obtain independently, struck at the exact moment when Russian defensive systems were cycling through a brief but critical vulnerability window. The timing wasn't lucky, it was deliberate. The precision wasn't approximate, it was surgical, and the aftermath has been, by all accounts emerging from both Russian military commentators and independent analysts, absolutely devastating. Within hours of the strike, Russian military sources, many of them with direct connections inside the defense establishment, began confirming that the attack had successfully destroyed critical communication infrastructure, coordinated operations across multiple sectors, had killed several senior officers whose expertise and institutional knowledge cannot be easily replaced, and had completely shattered a logistics pipeline that Russian forces had spent weeks painstakingly constructing to supply forward positions. The damage wasn't just tactical, it was strategic, and more importantly, it was psychological. Moscow's reaction arrived with a speed and intensity that revealed just how deeply this strike had rattled the Russian leadership. Within mere minutes of confirming the full extent of the destruction, Russian state media outlets launched a coordinated messaging campaign with a clarity and aggression that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The message was simple, direct, and absolutely unambiguous. Ukraine did not execute this attack alone. Every Russian military loss transforms into a direct American insult to Russian power and prestige. At that point, the war fundamentally ceases to be about territorial control, or NATO expansion, or Ukrainian sovereignty. It becomes, in Moscow's perception, a direct existential showdown with Washington. with Ukraine functioning merely as the convenient geographical stage upon which this great power confrontation is being performed. And once Russia fully adopts that worldview, once that interpretation becomes embedded in Kremlin decision-making, its entire calculus for acceptable risk proportional retaliation and appropriate response changes dramatically and dangerously. The technical execution of the strike is absolutely central to understanding why Moscow has reacted with such fury and why Russian officials are so convinced of American involvement. Ukrainian forces hit their targets during an extremely narrow vulnerability window created by a routine rotation in Russia's electronic warfare units, a temporary gap in coverage that lasted approximately 90 minutes. During that brief sliver of time, Ukrainian drones and precision-guided missiles, apparently directed by coordinates accurate to within meters, struck multiple high-value targets simultaneously in a synchronized assault that required extraordinary coordination. Achieving that level of synchronization, that degree of precision, that quality of timing demands several capabilities that Ukraine theoretically should not possess independently. It requires intimate advanced knowledge of Russian defensive rotation patterns and schedules. It requires real-time awareness of electronic warfare system positioning and coverage gaps. It requires meter-level targeting precision that typically comes only from military-grade satellite systems. And it requires communication security robust enough to coordinate multiple strike elements while evading Russian signals. Intelligence interception. Each of those individual components strongly implies outside technical support from a nation with advanced space-based reconnaissance and sophisticated military intelligence infrastructure. All of them combined make that implication virtually inescapable. And Russian military analysts are acutely, painfully aware of it. Russian military doctrine places absolutely enormous emphasis on safeguarding strategic command installations, the critical sites that manage operational orders, coordinate logistics across vast distances, process battlefield intelligence, and host senior command personnel. Successfully penetrating such a facility isn't to merely a tactical battlefield victory that destroys equipment and kills soldiers. It represents a strategic humiliation that exposes vulnerabilities. Russia has spent decades, enormous resources, trying to conceal and protect it, demonstrates conclusively that Ukraine, when bolstered by Western intelligence and technology, possesses the capability to strike locations that Moscow had convinced itself were effectively unreachable, safely positioned beyond Ukrainian operational range. And perhaps most damaging to Russian military confidence, it forces Russian commanders at every level to question whether any position behind the front lines, any headquarters installation, any logistics hub can truly be considered safe from Ukrainian targeting. That psychological blow, that erosion of confidence in their own security, may ultimately inflict more long-term damage to Russian military effectiveness than the immediate physical losses from the strike itself. Military forces that begin to doubt their own defensive security become cautious, reactive, and erratic. Commanders who fear they might be personally targeted in precision strikes become hesitant in their decision-making. And military systems that sense their own vulnerability and exposure begin to fracture and break down under psychological pressure. In Washington, the official response has been carefully calibrated, but unmistakably uneasy. Publicly, United States government officials have adopted a studied position of neither confirming nor denying the specifics of how closely American intelligence agencies and military planners are integrated into Ukraine's targeting selection processes and strike planning. That strategic ambiguity serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It protects sensitive operational details and intelligence sources and methods, It preserves American deniability in case escalation spirals, and it keeps adversaries uncertain about the exact extent of U.S. involvement, but privately, according to individuals familiar with internal discussions at senior levels of the Defense Department, State Department, and National Security Council, Washington is genuinely alarmed by the speed and intensity with which Moscow escalated its rhetoric and framed its accusations. Russia didn't follow the traditional diplomatic script that governs how nuclear powers typically handle serious incidents. The Kremlin didn't lodge a formal diplomatic protest through established channels. It didn't summon the American ambassador for carefully choreographed theatrical denunciations. It didn't engage in the usual dance of escalating diplomatic language gradually. Instead, Moscow jumped immediately to public accusation. It went straight to framing this as direct American military aggression, and it paired that explosive narrative with concrete military movements and force posture changes that suggest Russia is actively preparing for the possibility of broader confrontation beyond Ukraine's borders. In the hours immediately following the strike and Moscow's accusation, Russian strategic aviation units began relocating in patterns that Western intelligence agencies found extremely concerning. Long-range bomber aircraft capable of deploying nuclear-armed cruise missiles shifted from their regular bases to forward-ready airfields positioned closer to operational ranges. Russian submarine activity surged noticeably in the North Atlantic, with multiple vessels departing port in patterns consistent with dispersal operations designed to complicate Western tracking and targeting. Russian air defense units stationed far from Ukrainian airspace, including systems protecting Russian cities and strategic installations deep inside Russian territory, elevated their alert readiness levels. A Russia that has convinced itself it is actually battling the United States military rather than just Ukraine may begin contemplating response options that would have been reserved exclusively for superpower confrontations during the Cold War. And a Russia that perceives an existential threat to its security, its territorial integrity, or the survival of its government may invoke the nuclear use doctrines that explicitly permit preemptive escalation under certain defined circumstances. This is where the current situation becomes genuinely frighteningly perilous in ways that transcend normal battlefield risks. We now have three major actors, three nuclear powers or their close allies, interpreting the exact same event through completely incompatible perceptual lenses. Russia believes unshakably that the United States has crossed a fundamental red line and has now become a direct combatant in the war. The United States believes that Russia is deliberately inflating its rhetoric and manufacturing accusations to create justification for future Russian aggression and escalation that it was planning anyway. Ukraine believes that the strike's success proves Russian defensive weakness and military vulnerability and validates Ukrainian strategy of imposing maximum costs on Russian forces wherever possible. Each of these three interpretations is internally logical from the perspective of the actor holding it. Each is supported by evidence that is visible and persuasive to that particular government, and each interpretation, when acted upon, logically pushes the conflict inexorably toward greater escalation, rather than toward de-escalation, restraint, or diplomatic resolution. And this is the classic textbook pattern of how great power crises spiral out of control and metastasize into catastrophic wars. Not through one single dramatic spark or explicit decision to begin fighting, but through progressive, incremental divergence in perception and interpretation, until the gap becomes so wide that mutual understanding and reconciliation become effectively impossible. Historical research into the origins of major wars consistently shows that conflicts expand not because leaders actively desire unlimited war, but because escalation accumulates step by step, incident by incident, misunderstanding by misunderstanding, until the mechanisms of restraint that normally keep competition bounded simply collapse under accumulated pressure. Wars that all participants confidently expected would last only weeks or months transform into catastrophic conflict. Spanning years or even decades, the exact same escalatory logic is unfolding right now in real time between nuclear-armed states that collectively possess thousands upon thousands of warheads aimed at each other's cities, military installations, and critical infrastructure. The Kremlin's accusation against the United States is not mere rhetorical posturing or propaganda designed purely for domestic Russian consumption. It represents a deliberate strategic repositioning with profound implications for what Russia might do next. By formally naming the United States as an active participant in military strikes on Russian sovereign territory, Moscow has methodically laid the political and psychological groundwork that would allow it to justify responses that previously would have seemed wildly disproportionate or recklessly escalatory. The logic becomes disturbingly simple. If America is directly attacking Russia, then Russia possesses the inherent right to retaliate against America. If America is directing, and thus guiding Ukrainian military operations, then striking American assets, whether intelligence facilities, logistics hubs, or even military bases, transforms from naked aggression into what Russia can frame as legitimate self-defense.